My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
This episode is brought to you by Greenlight. Get this. Adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Spotify. Greenlight.com/Spotify.
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills. Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Room, a horror video game podcast and proud member of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger.
And I'm the other one, Neil Bolt.
And this week we have another installment of Making the Case For, in which either Neil or myself make the case for a game that, while not always universally beloved or acclaimed, we still find to be notable for an aspect of its design. Now, considering my first pick for Making the Case, which we debuted last month, was for Sanitarium, which ended up being a game that was front to back pretty fantastic, we found. So I may have inadvertently set the bar a bit high quality wise. But with that pressure-free intro, Neil, would you please make the case for Quantic Dream's Heavy Rain, which just so happens is celebrating its 15th anniversary this year?
Yes, it does, which did kind of bring it to mind. And I think I sort of queried doing this like in the past, but it's like, well, we'll get to it when we get to it, sort of thing. But when you sort of came forward with this sort of making the case for a thing, I took it as a challenge, I suppose, sort of thing. Well, what do I think, has to have a reputation that isn't good? The weird thing with Heavy Rain is, of course, that it, when it came out, it did well critically as well. Everything. It reviewed well. People liked it and even loved it. And I was among those people. So that was me coming into this one going, yes, absolutely. This is definitely one to go for. Obviously, in the years since it's come out, and I think probably with David Cage's reputation, who made this, things have not quite, it's kind of like BioShock Infinite in terms of like, there will be people that like it, but there's a lot more people who will tell you they don't. So we get into that, definitely. But yeah, so as a recap, given it is 15 years ago, and that feels ridiculous until you play it, to be fair. It was a PS3 exclusive. Another one of those things that helped, I suppose, the console have a unique sort of standpoint in terms of its exclusive games. So Quantic Dream had done this game called Fahrenheit, which got some acclaim for what it was. It was like the storytelling method for it was like quite exciting for the time and felt a bit different. And Heavy Rain was like the big budget version of that, with the Sony power, the Sony backing, the full use of that, PlayStation 3 power that not every developer got to use. And with these great facial animations and for the time, I will say that. This the point in video game history where we are, really going into stories and how big stories are, and we are, in a post Uncharted 2 world, but a pre The Last of Us world. So what people expect from stories isn't quite that high. But so this is a nice sort of pulpy, very Euro detective murder mystery drama thing, and it's viewed from several different protagonists' sort of viewpoints throughout the game. Basically, about to begin with, a father who loses his son, and quite infamously, as we'll get into, and then just so happens to lose the other one much later in the game to a serial killer who targets children. Yeah, like but not dad of the year here, sort of stuff.
No.
No, but you also have the story of a detective who's working on the case, and you have a woman who's embroiled in it as well. And yeah, basically how their stories intertwine and come to the conclusion of like solving this mystery. But mostly it's the story of Ethan Mars, this father who is put to the test by the serial killer to try and rescue his son by doing all sorts of mad shit. So it's kind of like French Saw, I suppose, in a lot of ways. It's not super gory. Kind of like 13 Game of Death. I don't know if you'd seen that film. Like,
yes, I have.
yeah, it was like a Ron Perlman remake of it or something as well. So yeah, that idea where you are just forced to do like an escalating series of challenges that are just ridiculous and stuff like that. So this is an interesting game to talk about in the context of when we talk about Sanitarium and all the other games we've been talking about recently in the point and click sort of environment, because we said there are games in the last 15 years that have changed what that is. Now, Telltale's games were part of that. They changed the idea of what point and click were in a more accessible way for a more modern audience. I think Heavy Rain's kind of like the middle ground, where it's trying to be, it's a more hands-on point and click adventure, but it's not like a fully controlled game. So it's this weird middle ground where it's kind of like a point and click game, but it's also kind of like the third person games, that sort of mix and match thing, which catches a wider audience because they think it's this thing and this thing. And I think that was something that really contributed to this game's success at the time. And we'll get into all that, in terms of like how that worked or if it worked. But yeah, at the time it worked well enough. As I said, it sold over 5 million copies very quickly for this kind of game. And David Cage got to go and make his even weirder game, Beyond Two Souls, with Willem Dafoe in rare video game form. And Elliot Page, isn't it, as well? That was in it. So yeah, that was that was a game I also kind of considered for this as well. But I think you can't get to that without doing this. So yeah, and this is definitely the more horror centric. It's got a supernatural element, but this is like I said, it's got a Saw element, it's got a horror thing, and just like the overall tone of it is quite moody. And well, again, we'll get into all this, but yeah, that's my long-winded way of talking about Heavy Rain to begin with, at least.
Hey, it's your pick for this week, so you get to be as quote long-winded as you want to be about it. That's part of what's great about this sort of like little series that we're doing, is that it's like, hey, we're giving each other the floor to chat about whatever game, and no matter how beloved or how vindicated it might be, we get to chat about why it means something to us. So that's more than okay. And I'm glad that you picked Heavy Rain, a game that I admittedly hadn't gotten to, but I was glad that you picked it, not just because I hadn't had a chance to play it yet, but I was more interested to talk about this game than their previous game, which was Fahrenheit, which I think in the States it was called Indigo Prophecy. Right?
Yeah.
And
right.
So that was a game that I have played and did enjoy, but from what I've learned about Heavy Rain in the 15 years since its release, is that Fahrenheit in a lot of ways was not so much a tech demo, but it was more or less like the blueprint that Heavy Rain was able to kind of like build upon, right, and expand upon with utilizing new technology in a lot of ways, and also more cinematic elements, which, as you said, we'll get into with some of the behind the scenes of Heavy Rain and whatnot. But I was really interested in this over Fahrenheit because of the fact that, like, I specifically remember the time at which Heavy Rain was, not only released, but sort of like the discussion around it. And the first time I ever even heard of the concept, like interactive drama, like that's how that game I remember was being lauded and being promoted in these things. And I was one of those things when this game came out. Just to date myself, I was only graduating high school in 2010. So it was kind of like, this was not the type of game that I would ever consider playing at that age of, whatever, 17 or 18. I was very much in, the trenches of Battlefield and things like that. But this was definitely one of those games, though, that I remember for just being not only a departure from my understanding or what I expected games or thought games could be, but also because of the fact that this was a game that really was trying to bridge that gap between obviously film and TV and games, right? It's kind of like trying to find certain elements that you can take from film and take, whether it's like the episodic nature of TV shows and whatnot, like taking those elements and applying it to a game. And, this was a game that, as you mentioned, when it was originally released, was applauded by critics, financially performed well. And it's a thing that was really interesting when you brought this to the table for us to discuss, because of the fact that I'm interested by the end of our conversation to see like how many of those elements that were brand new essentially to most games and whatnot for 2010. How much of that has become so commonplace in games that at this point you don't even think about mentioning it if you're going to review it or talk about it in some ways. So it'll be really interesting, I think, when we get to the end of our chat about Heavy Rain, to see what aspects of this game have aged really well and what aspects of it that it was lauded for at the time have more or less become sort of like commonplace design. That's one of those types of things about conversations about games, is that, initially, sometimes some of the hype around a game is stemming from the fact, oh, we're doing something new. We're doing something nobody's ever done before. So there's not that same barometer for quality. And this is not like a long-winded way of me for saying like, there's nothing to like about this game 15 years later. That's not where I'm kind of like going with this, but I'm just really fascinated by games such as Heavy Rain that are so notable, like unmissable when they're coming out, at some pretty pivotal points in, game history, if you will, that are making big strides in terms of technology and again, bridging that gap. And it's just interesting, I think, to see like all these years removed from its original release and the hype surrounding it, like how much of those qualities have withstood the test of time and how much of them are notable for their inclusion, but more or less have become commonplace in, games that had a similar sort of like narrative emphasis as Heavy Rain does.
This is it. There are definitely elements of this game that bled through into other things. And like I said, it from the top, I did mention about like that point and click evolution and how it does sort of bleed into the games that would come later, and third person games, and first person ones, especially in the indie scene that was just sort of really building up again at this time. You're getting context and sensitive controls and stuff, for instance, like that. That was a thing when you think about a lot of the walking simulator kinds of games. They've done stuff like that where you have to pull and push and certain drawers or cupboards or doors or whatever. Amnesia series actually is another one that uses that quite well in later games. I like that. The sort of tactile nature of this game, it is different to how you would handle it in like a regular game where you just press a button and the drawer opens, take the stuff out the drawer sort of thing. And I think part of that is born from like what they were doing it for. Like the PS3 sort of, the six-axis controller had this whole thing about motion and movement and using that as well. And so like early in the game, you get those great examples of like doing stuff like brushing your teeth and you've got to shake the controller, and like how many games have done that since? Stuff like that where it just feels gimmicky now. But then it was like very rare you had games going to that level of detail to make you do the right movement and motion, and I mean, as recently as something like Astrobot, where you have a game that really uses the controller in so many different ways and has fun with it. And the other thing that it did use on the PS3, especially, was the PlayStation Move, which of course was like a part of what would go on to be a part of the VR setup as well, where you could sort of control things even in an even more tactile way. Still crude by like the standards we get to in VR and stuff like that, but still having a bit more control, it felt like, than you did for using normal controllers. Now, my experience at the time was like, this is cool for about 10 minutes. And then it was like, yeah, this isn't really good if you want to play the game in particular ways, sort of thing. Yeah, like, because the reaction speeds and like the handling of it didn't quite work. But prototype idea, and I think in many spaces, including VR, which use those sort of separate handheld controllers to have these more tactile sort of operations, it kind of worked quite well as an early sort of prototype of that. One of those things that Sony did well with like studios and its own technology were to try these things out, not necessarily be the one that was successful at them first, but they would subtly get those things. Like everyone used to say about like Sony would copy like Nintendo stuff, but when you look at like the iToy being before like other camera apps and things like that, and doing motion gaming before stuff like the Wii, like Sony weren't afraid to try stuff like that. And the PS3 in itself was a very gimmicky console, which I have a great fondness for, and it almost feels like the perfect home for Heavy Rain in terms of like it's a weird game, but it's also like nothing else at the time that you could get anywhere else, and it fit, and it felt like it was designed for that console. And I think that is also why it's a bit tricky going to the PS4 version or a PC version. It's like you're not quite getting the same experience. Like you can do some of those things, but it's not quite. And as you mentioned, the passage of time means that not all of these things will be quite as strong.
Yeah, I'm playing. I played the PC port
Mm.
this week, and yeah, it was one of those things where I naturally, played it with a controller and whatnot. But at the same time, it was just like there were some hiccups here and there along the way and whatnot in terms of how the game handled or performed and whatnot. But at the same time, I don't know that it was as rough as I was expecting. But yeah, there's definitely something missed, I think, when you have games that originally are notable because of the technology that's inherent to the given console that it was originally released on. That maybe something along the lines there can be lost a little bit. But in terms of performance, like I think you told me before the show that you had some performance issues there with the port that you played, right?
Mm. Yeah, because PS5 doesn't always work with certain games
Yeah.
that are backwards compatible, and yeah, Heavy Rain is one of those where it starts up and you get like flickery screens, juddery lettering, and like the frame rate just going terribly. And like I said to you at the time, it's like, oh God, I'm sure it ran better than this, like that. And then realized it must do. And yeah, a quick trip to Reddit suddenly like, yep, this is a problem and you can solve it, but it is like a temporary fix. So I had to play it in bursts of about 1 hour before the game would just basically go back. I think we talked about this when we were saying Manhunt, where it has a similar problem on PS5 where you play that port of it and it just doesn't work at all because it's
Yeah.
so yes, some games don't survive that, unfortunately, but at least in this case it was fixable because yeah, like PC would have been weird. I think I've got it on PC somewhere, but yeah, but I kind of wanted to play it with the whole PlayStation thing to remember that sort of experience. But
Mm.
yeah, that was a worrying start, definitely.
Sure. Yeah, I think back in the day, the only part of this game that I had played was that opening prologue, which is with, as you said, our protagonist Ethan like exploring his house, and then the mall sequence.
Yeah.
And I remember being like taken by that aspect that you briefly mentioned, which is like a game that really has you literally living the life of like a normal person before,
Yeah.
all the insane serial killer stuff happens. Like the notion that you could walk around an environment and interact with almost every single thing in the environment, from the innocuous to things that are a little bit more relevant to that character, to their life, giving you this kind of like snapshot preview of what that life looks like, other than when they're, not losing children left and right, or dealing with a serial killer, which, when you come to it now, it's hard not to be like, well, okay, what is this in service of? But back in the day, I think, and even still to this day to a degree, like I found that the level of interactivity was very notable because of the reason I just said. Like that's not something that you saw in a lot of games where you can just pick up things and then interact with them, which whether players are going to admit it or not, I think does give you a bit of a sense of like the lived in aspect that everyone wants from characters and game worlds. Like it's
Yeah.
not just that you're a person in this world, but you get to interact with the day-to-day items that they have to utilize. There's an instance like, and it's an instance of players being rewarded in their exploration is that, you can walk up to the easel and basically Ethan can sit there and begin to work on some of his architecture drawings and things like that, which again,
Yeah.
like, you not only get to see him working, but you get to see like a pretty integral part to his life.
Yeah.
And so that was one of those aspects. And even now, like coming to this game and getting to play through it all the way, it's one of those things where I'm like, I can't not view some of this interactivity with every part of an environment, and half of those being pretty innocuous overall. I can't not view those at times as just being like, okay, I get it. I can interact with stuff. Not all of it's going to be rewarding in the same way that it was in that opening first hour or two.
Yeah.
But I go back to that prologue specifically because I think it's a great example of a tutorial in that you're playing this game that has an investigatory aspect. And yeah, like an investigator, you can interact with everything and you can get clues. And sometimes it's going to be helpful to the investigation. Sometimes it's going to be completely useless. But that
Yeah.
opening prologue, I think, serves as a great tutorial in that sense of teaching the player that, yes, if you interact with most parts of this world, you will get some kind of feedback, whether it's important information or not. But that's a great sort of like hand-holding way, not hand-holding, I suppose. That's a way of not holding the player's hand, letting them kind of just like aimlessly explore this house and really like learn to decipher what's important and what's not on their own without a bunch of, yellow paint or red exclamation marks.
Yeah, and the stuff, as you said, you can do like the architectural work where you don't have to do it. It doesn't really matter. Like, so you can miss it and do it your own way, and that's fine. But so that's a good example early on, just saying, it's like it doesn't matter if you fuck up some things. It's like the story will go a certain way, and this stuff doesn't matter. It's like a balance that was been tricky for years, in terms of like having a branching storyline. You want to not telegraph it too early that what is and isn't important, but in terms of like getting that in-world depth, and if you're going to make an interactive movie, effectively you want to give players something you wouldn't get from a movie, which is to touch and feel the environment a bit more and get a bit more background information than just like what's in a scene sort of thing. And I know that's like maybe a foolish plan, in terms of what David Cage was going for, but you aren't really going to make an interactive movie like this. But in terms of like the idea, like this is like a decent compromise for that. I think you can get, in terms of like setting a mood, like being presented like a film, in terms of these not fixed cameras, so to speak, because you can like shoot between them, which again is very film like. You can choose which camera is like you want to sort of view the image from, and so it kind of gives you like a directorial sort of power to a degree as well. Another cool thing that happens at that point is you can listen to the character's thoughts, so to get an idea of what to do next, like. And there's like a selection of things, and again, some are important, some aren't, and it's a nice little touch, rather than have a character just say out loud, "Oh yeah, maybe I should blah 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 this," and like trying to lead you down a certain path. They're like having just certain. It's actually quite subtle when I think of some modern games, that have that sort of flow. That so they will try and lead you towards a certain path. And here it's like it's a little more vague, like which is maybe because the technology and the limitations and not really doing much of this stuff at the time. But at the same time, I think it's kind of refreshing because this kitchen sink approach, I suppose, to getting everything in there. It's like there's stuff that is just like dead weight if you didn't really but it's good dead weight in a way because it makes it feel like some stuff can like life, or like some stuff matters, some stuff doesn't, and you can get through it. And same with the thoughts and feelings that you have as a character. Another thing about that intro as well, like in terms of like this tactile control system and like the context sensitive thing, the laying of the plates, for the birthday party thing, like that, where you are sort of encouraged to sort of do it slowly, so you're not like, because these are fine plates and you don't want to damage them. And of course, if you just stab the button forward like normal, you get admonished for it. Like it's like, oh, come on, like there's whoa, those plates delicate sort of thing, and it's like that's cool because again, these are little things teaching you how the game works and plays, and it's still it's an odd tutorial in terms of like how it feels to the rest of the game. I mean, I get why, because the rest of the game is set in the aftermath of what happens in this, but considering this brown, grim reputation the game has, the opening is like sickeningly bright. Like the gardens are like, they look like Nuketown in Call of Duty. Those very fake sort of outsidey plastic grass, sort of massively garish colors. And even the mall kind of has that aspect to it. But it's fine because again, something about it ends up feeling quite Euro horror and very like dreamlike, in terms of like compared to the rest of the game. And some of that's intentional, some of that clearly isn't. But I think when we think of Euro horror, that's very true of that as well. Whether it be like the dubbing's off or like they had to cut bits for like a rating in certain countries, and so scenes don't work the same way. And there is this like offness that kind of intrigues. I mean, we'll get into it. The mall scene is definitely not nowhere near as effective as it's supposed to be. Like this is where Ethan loses his son in the mall. But fuck that kid, seriously, by the way. In this scene, it's like, don't go off. Kid just keeps going off, like just constantly, like that. But the whole thing with like the red balloon and doing the really cliche thing of like, oh, that's his kid, and turns the kid around and it's just a kid who looks almost identical and has a red balloon but isn't him. And just the way that you'll chase the balloon and you'll be like adamant that you've gone the right way and chase the right balloon, and it disappears and goes like 5 miles off the other way. I like it because it does just put you in this weird like nightmarescape of that situation. The anxiety of a kid walking off in a busy public place. Like even when he goes to like pay for that balloon, you're having to do that context thing of like each pocket, like they're searching every pocket to find your wallet, sort of thing like that, whilst also keeping an eye on the kid. And it's like that's really well done, I think. In terms of like just getting that mindset as a parent, I know for sure. It's like just stay there, I just didn't getting flustered in public because you just want to get on with it.
I was going to say, like, I don't have kids, but as somebody that works with kids and is responsible often for a large number of kids at a single moment, it's like, I've had the anxiety of like doing a head count before we leave to go to, the next, usually it's like a field trip or something. And it's like, oh, okay, I've got all but one student. Where's, little Johnny gone to? And you have that moment of anxiety, even though, I'm not a complete fucking idiot and don't lose children. It's like, oh no, he's just standing behind a rock that I can't see at this given moment. Right. It's like that kind of thing where it captures that that pit feeling in your stomach of just like, oh fuck, well, I don't know where they are. And granted, obviously that's going to be a lot more heightened if it's your own child. But I wanted to mention quickly before we move on, like something that you mentioned earlier about the fact that you can access each character's like train of thought, right? And you have little sort of like bits of dialogue options that pop up, and then you can click on it and you get more
Mm.
about their sort of like headspace at that given moment. In that particular moment when Ethan's lost his son, and it's throughout the game when there's a moment of tension or there's a moment of like real stakes involved, whether it's the life of another or it's the life of the character in a given moment that you're controlling, is that those words begin to like shake and quiver, which kind of like
Yeah.
illustrates the anxiety that the character's having. And like that was like one of those little stylistic elements that I really liked about this game, in that it's like, okay, you not only have this text that pops up, but also it's being reflective of that character in their current headspace. And, you know, it's not a major thing. It's not like the text is shaking to the point of like it's barely decipherable in terms of what action you'll play out. Um, Quite often it is the same option, but multiple times and shaking. So it's further just showing like, okay, you have to make this decision and it's the only decision, but that doesn't change the stakes that are involved in making that choice, even if there is
Mm.
only one right choice. And that's like one of those little aspects that I liked about this game, sort of like making the plight of the protagonist in a given section being very palpable for the player because of that fact, and like really making that come through in a way that was, you know, reinforced through what the player's seeing, but also in sort of like the UI design of this game, which I think
Mm.
was quite good.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something we have to mention, of course, in this scene, which is the most infamous, the thing you knew about before ever
Yeah.
playing the game. Yeah, which is of course press X to Jason.
Yep.
Now
Jason.
there's a it's down to the
Jason.
line. Yeah, it's that line reading, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's that's the problem. It's like clearly, like I said, can you say Jason in several ways? And it's like maybe they should have done more, but like just have a bit more variety. But there's that one particular one which is just like doesn't feel like I don't know. The more I listened to it, the more I was like, no, actually, yeah, I could. It probably does sound weird because you're having to repeat it in that exact same tone. There's no like not like a real person like saying things with slightly different inflections and feelings and yeah, the tension should change that, I suppose, and it doesn't, and it's repetitive and weird. And of course, because you, the player, can press it as many times as you like, as evidenced by that video that made it famous, it does just sound ridiculous. And yeah, again, but it's this isn't a game that's dialogue is going to win any awards. I think it did, but which is probably tells you more about like where we were with gaming at the time, but it's all through that opening, like there is some like cheesy as fuck like line readings, but again, I do kind of liken it to like a Euro horror dubbing. It almost because you've got France standing in for Philadelphia in the case of this game, and like I remember one of the earliest funny things anyone said about this game was like that house that you go around in the beginning is like it's a European house design in America, and it's like which probably isn't like unusual now, like but then would be like it's very distinctly it's like it does feel very like French when I think of like a lot of French TV or movies I've watched. It's like I get that sort of layout a bit, and and I was talking to you like earlier before we did this podcast about like this horror film that was like pretending to be American, but it was shot in Belgium with like
Mm.
Belgian actors, and you kept kind of hearing it come through, and it was like it was a very pastiche sort of idea of America, and yet there's a lot of that here, and like I said, because of my fondness for those kind of things, like it works for me more than it should. Like when it is being a bit weird and off, like and like a game can be at this time as well, where it's like awkwardly ahead of the curve in some ways, and it will very quickly slip behind it, in the aftermath. But yeah, it's such an interesting game to look back at in that regard, like just at these little moments, and even that, the the memification of this game in that moment is like just showing you how things in video games, trying to make them film like, don't work when you're giving the player control of certain things, because they can turn it into a farce when it's supposed to be an anxiety-ridden moment. Like, and yeah, that is. But like I said, that whole thing just feels like a weird treacle dream thing, where you are just like, you can't find the thing you're looking for, and your voice is kind of weird, and yeah, it's like that. I mean, it happens clearly because the rest of the story happens, but it's weird, even down to like where Jason like dies, like where you don't see him die, and the way it looks, like doesn't even look like he gets hit by the car, to be honest. But it's just so mawkish and over the top and strange. But yeah, it's the only way you can kind of appreciate it now is to sort of take it as this sort of weirdo sort of. If it was like a movie of any kind, it's like that sort of era of like 70s, 80s Italian cinema, almost French in this case.
Yeah. This is the thing. Like, I like all those aspects. For me, the one thing that really hasn't aged well is kind of like those performances. Like a lot of the voice acting in this game just like simply takes me out of it. Outside of that Jason moment, like overall, it was one of those things where it's like, is it worth mentioning because of the fact that like they're quite dated at this point? But I don't know. Even still, I feel like if people were able to make jokes about some of the line delivery back then, like that's maybe an indication that for as much as this game like strives to be very cinematic in that regard, like from the look of things, I totally agree with. But, and this is excluding, the score, but like in terms of the voice acting in this game, it like time and time again kind of like took me out of moments that I thought were supposed to be like more clearly supposed to be more serious, which adds maybe like a level of melodrama to this that kind of like is something that could only really be there outside of the game's initial release because of how that stuff is kind of perceived, maybe. Yeah. Which wasn't a deal breaker or anything for me, but it certainly was one of those aspects that kind of just made me laugh a little bit, especially when maybe some of the awkwardness from the voice acting is because, you have people that maybe English isn't their first language, or English is, they're coming from another part of the world than North America for this type of game. So that's just one of those aspects of the voice acting that took me out of it a little bit. But I think that we can talk about it when we come back from our briefest of breaks in a moment. For a game that initially was notable for being very cinematic, I think that's probably the strongest element of this game that has carried over in those 15 years and is still notable to this day for, the sort of ways in which the story of Heavy Rain plays out, and a lot of those really cinematic choices that are made in this game to telling this narrative that makes it a little bit more notable than just, another sort of like police serial killer procedural. But we can chat about more of the intricacies of Heavy Rain storytelling and the lens with which Quantic Dream used to tell that when we come back from our break in a moment.
Vitamin Water Zero Sugar has great taste, zero BS, and obviously zero sugar. For those with zero room in their calendar, zero patience for slow walkers, those who get 0 hours of sleep on a Saturday night, have zero filter, zero given, and zero interest in grabbing a plain, boring water. Grab a delicious Vitamin Water Zero Sugar today.
Today's top story, the flavor merger of the century between the Peanut Butter Group and Chocolatey Corp. Joining me is a PBC executive.
Thanks for having me, Barry.
Now, how did you know the merger and the byproduct of it, Jif peanut butter and chocolate flavored spread, would be a success?
It was a gut feeling, a rumbling, if you will. Besides, they're two titans of taste.
Very true. Goes great with pretzels.
And pancakes.
Apples too, I bet. Try Jif PBC today.
At Starbucks, we've more than doubled parental leave for full and part-time baristas, giving them up to 18 weeks of paid time off, so they can be there for early bedtimes, late nights, first laughs, and spend more time with the best company they know. At Starbucks, benefits like parental leave are just the start. Learn more about Starbucks industry-leading benefits at starbucks.com/partners.
And we're back from our break. And as I was briefly mentioning before, you know, the aspect of this game that I've always found to be notable, and that's, you know, from my very brief time with it when it originally came out, and then, you know, the 15 years since that release, and just getting to like see clips and stuff online and then getting to play it myself, is that I still find that this game's use of character and, more importantly, like camera perspective is still probably the most interesting aspect of like how this game plays out. You know, the one aspect we haven't touched upon is the fact that you're going to play as many different characters that are tied up in the narrative of Heavy Rain. You know, you're not just playing as protagonist Ethan. You're going to also play as, you know, Madison, a journalist, Norman, an FBI agent, and then Scott, who is a private investigator. And, you know, you get this sort of like episodic feel almost, in that you get a new chapter, you get a new environment, you get a new character, and you get to explore this new aspect or this new lens of the investigation that has a different purpose, a different investment in what's going on. But also like the ways in which the world and the story of Heavy Rain gets told is through both, you know, the typical sort of almost over the shoulder camera perspective that the player has in investigating environments, but also, you know, you have some very cinematic angles that pop up on the screen simultaneously. So like you almost get this little comic book approach to perspectives, and, you know, you get a box in the lower right that shows the player free moving the character. On the left-hand bottom left, you have, you know, a different camera angle of an environment. And then maybe in the top left, you have, you know, a third perspective of an environment. Like early on when you're playing as Scott, the private investigator, you go into like a grocery store, right? And naturally the grocery store gets held up while you're there, and you're in the back of the store. And as the player's maneuvering through that store, the bottom right is composed with the player's perspective as Scott, but then you can keep an eye on what's going on at the front of the store through CCTV lenses in the store, and those two other boxes that have different angles and whatnot. And so that sort of approach throughout the game, I thought, was just like a way to make maybe pretty routine sort of investigations of environments feel more cinematic in a way that gives the player maybe, you know, not only a new angle to view that environment through, but also just like making the unremarkable more notable, and, you know, having this like cinematic flair to it. I think overall definitely does some heavy lifting in terms of Heavy Rain's more or less sort of like police procedural approach to its narrative.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the glum sort of rainy look of this game is still like really atmospheric, and I think it's the way it's shot, and giving you only limited control over what you can see is really helpful for that. You know, I think this harkens back to, you know, what we said about like fixed cameras in survival horror. It was like what it does show you is always interesting. What it you don't quite see like leaves a little bit of mystery, which is nice. I mean, it's not quite to that level here because, as you said, you've got the multi-cam thing, which I suppose the best way to put it is kind of like if you remember 24 used to do that, you know, a lot where you'd have those sort of things. Except most times here it's like one scene, one scenario, multiple cameras sort of thing, like your modern day Ridley Scott with your fucking camera van looking at, you know, filming all these things at once. But it is an interesting way of doing it. Some would say maybe a bit just over the top, like unnecessary. But I do think, as you said, there are scenes where you look at it and go, "Oh, yeah, it's cool that you kind of can play with perspective like that, like in sneaking and seeing a different angle without having full camera control like you would normally want or need in that situation." It covers all the bases and keeps true to its sort of style, which, yeah, I think is a fantastic way of handling it. But I- it's, I call them screen slices, I suppose, because they, they do it quite early from pretty much the first scene, don't they? Where like, you know, where Ethan wakes up in his house, and you just have these little segments of different parts of the house, and like leading into him waking up, sort of thing. And yeah, suppose it can feel pretentious, if you want to say that in terms of just trying to make it feel more like a movie. But I do think it works in terms of like, because there's so much effort has gone in. They did put a lot of research into going to Philadelphia and researching the place and getting this. I've never been, so I can't speak for how much it's like Philadelphia, but it does just feel like that very 2000 sort of brown, dreary American sort of dilapidated town sort of thing, or city like that. And yeah, I think because of those camera angles, even where there could be problems like with the aging of time and how graphics have changed, that the places might look bad, but I think generally the environments after the opening look like pretty damn good a lot of the time, probably because it's just depressingly easy to do like browns and grays and things like that, and make it feel like ugh, like that. But yeah, even like when they do have like different environments as well, when they have like indoor stuff, it's pretty good. There's that scene with Madison later in the game where she's escaping a nut job, and going through this house that's like full of all detail. It's like a cool, almost survival horror-y style house in that regard. And it's, I'm trying to think of the exact film it feels like. That sort of brown, scuzzy America that's always depressing, but I can't think of exactly what it is. Partially, ironically, I say it's probably like the American remake of Dark Water a bit. Where there's a bit of that stuff like that. That's the thing that came to mind the most, I think. But yeah, it's aged really well in that regard. And I do think when we're talking like heavy lifting here, the score, I think, this is definitely one of the early examples for me in terms of a game that I think the score did a lot for me that the game probably didn't deserve. But it's like I loved it. Norman Corbell is a Canadian composer. Did this score at Abbey Road and everything like that, and I think he did all the scores for those sort of Quantic Dream games at the time. So yeah, but this one, I think he died. Yeah, I think he died just a few years after this as well. So, but for this one, it's stuck in my memory since the first time I heard it. It's just this sort of very mournful thing, lots of strings and stuff like that, and it suits this sort of melodramatic thing. And again, when I talk about this Euro horror feel to it, it's one of those soundtracks that doesn't feel out of place, but it does feel a bit overblown, but in a good way. And I really enjoyed that. And you want your score to sort of evoke whatever you're seeing. That's the idea. And to me, I can't separate it from this sort of rain-sodden, dreary, dark game, which and that sounds like a bad thing, but honest to God, it's the reason why the game gets a bad rap is I think it looks beautiful, for what it is, and I think that score is perfect for it, like that. So yeah, that sort of combo, I think at the time, especially for critics as well and for players, I think did help make the game feel a lot bigger and more swish, and kind of paper over some of these cracks that have become more obvious, especially because of like what other developers have done in terms of storytelling and motion capture and stuff like that. So yeah, but those are definitely the strengths of this game to this day.
So that is absolutely one of the aspects of Heavy Rain that I think still holds up really well. And it's why this game has such a unique, I don't know, just like an overall unique aesthetic, or maybe the aesthetic itself is not that unique, but it's just that it feels like it's the perfect distillation of like the downpour, bleak environment that's reflective of the crime that's being, at the core of the conceit of this game, right? That being that very sort of like industrial, bleak. It has some of that Saw identity a little bit, where every other environment you're in looks like if you bump into something, you're going to get tetanus. And having a score that goes along with that, I think, is so strong to what the identity of Heavy Rain is. Like that aspect of how the game looks and sounds and feels, like we've seen that in other places, but this feels like it's probably one of the strongest examples of something that just like commits to that theme throughout outside of that prologue, right? As we mentioned, the prologue is bright, it's very colorful. And then once you get into the thick of the game, that all gets thrown right out the window after the first like 30 minutes or so, for this world that is just like at every turn, you're like, yeah, no shit, there's probably serial killers and kids going missing and stuff. Like the world is this bleak and this depressing to be in. Like, yeah, of course these things happen here. And, you mentioning composer Norman Corbeil, like one of the aspects that I think I didn't really appreciate until I got maybe halfway through, and, you're jumping through all these different characters and their perspectives of what's going on in the story and whatnot, and them giving different credence to the investigation, which I think we should get into in a little bit. But, each one of them has a different sort of like instrumental associated with them because of the fact that you have all these different characters. They each are coming to it with their own separate things. So naturally, each one of them is going to have music that is slightly different based upon who you're playing. So, you have basically like with Ethan, I believe he was mostly pianos. And then you had like a chamber orchestra for Madison, symphony orchestra for Norman, and then brass and flutes for Scott. And like, those are obviously things that I'm not going to know in the thick of things, right? I only found out about that afterwards, but learning that and then, rewatching some of the cinematics or rewatching some of the elements that were pivotal to the narrative with certain characters, like that becomes more notable. And that shows that there are ways that you can build up the either, thematic relevance or build up the tension and make it very personable to those characters. When we were earlier talking about the cinematic nature of this game and how that could have very easily just been like marketing buzz or this kind of like try hard nature of bridging the gap type of a thing. But like this game really does commit in the ways in which it tells its narrative. I don't necessarily think like Heavy Rain has a great narrative, but I think the ways in which it tells this story and makes each one of those features, whether it's multiple characters, whether it's the thematic relevance to just their perceptions of the world and whatnot, and how the different cinematic point of views or the score like accompanies that or elevates those aspects. Like that's what's impressive, I think, about Heavy Rain and whatnot. Because how forgettable could it be if each time you played one of these characters, it was just kind of like, yeah, I'm going through another environment as somebody else, but it doesn't really feel that different. I found that like each time you're swapping between the characters, you are learning something significant. And then the significance of the things you're learning, they really do play out differently once you finish the game, because you're able to, reflect back on them. And you do have some moments where you're like, oh, okay, this should have stood out to me more, or this aspect of it felt significantly different compared to my time with another character.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's like it is really distinct in those different stories, and the fact that while in connecting them all as you get towards the end of the game is clunky in places in terms of storytelling, I think the structure of the game and getting them to that place and making them different enough that when they do converge, they just have enough similar points that the game still feels the same in terms of what you're doing, in terms of what happens. It's quite impressive, to be honest. And yeah, I think the more, as you say, the more you sort of learn from each section and from each character's sort of like weaknesses, if you will, I suppose, like with Madison, there's this whole troubled past thing, and like she's probably the weakest written character of the four, which I mean in terms of like having proper backstory and having things to do. Yet she was very much one of the showcase things for the game before it came out. But like Scott and with his like his Asperger's, I think he has, and like and
Inhaler, I believe.
That's it, Inhaler, and so he's got that, and like his sort of relationship with that prostitute mother, who's the mother of one of the victims, and like that, and even Norman Jaden, the sort of weird outlier in this sort of thing where he's kind of like the sci-fi part of the game that doesn't feel like a normal sort of environment, because he has like this fucking. He basically has the mind palace from Sherlock before it was a thing. I think so. It's just, but he's also addicted to this drug, and that plays a part into his story. So I like that it will end up basically, you know, going to the same case, which is trying to find Ethan's son, and the ways they all come at that are so different and set piece. Now I think Ethan probably has like the lion's share in terms of like what's memorable, in terms of like what's, because he has to do those trials and things like that, which really are like some of the most intense set pieces in the game, in terms of like the few bits that you can really play and go, ooh, yeah, okay, you don't have to worry about like the dialogue, you don't have to worry about the facial animations too much or line delivery. You're just in the action, and some of it's like, oof, like that driving into oncoming traffic bit, for instance, is like
Yeah.
the trial is like that's still really like, oof, it's quite nerve wracking. That whole sort of thing about where he's got to murder that guy and all that, he's doing each of these things to basically get a piece of the address where his son's being kept, and that's the idea, is that what will you go through to basically save your son, which turns out to be like the part of the killer's modus operandi, that they want to basically prove that a father will sacrifice themselves for their son at to an insane degree like this. And yeah, I mean, Ethan really does go for it in that story. Just the electrical pylons thing as well. Just fucking nuts. It's just the whole mechanics and tactile thing of doing the cutting off of the finger as well. Just like that was, again, the sort of thing that control system was made for. Just little grimy type things to really like drag you in. The intention is great there, and I think it stuff that you said before, like stuff that would later go on to be like in other games and would be like revered because they like balanced out these things in the background, and smoothed out the problems this game has. But yeah, these four characters, I think they had their moments. They all had their moments, and I think, as you said, the big thing of that is because they come at each story differently enough, and they feel like they're doing different things enough that you don't get dragged down into just the most depressing story of all, which of course is Ethan's.
Yeah, I think that for me, like with this narrative, the thing that kind of made it a peg above, I suppose, the general kind of police procedural as I've described this game, which I think definitely can be said about a significant portion of it. Like those Saw elements that you mentioned, like make for some pretty entertaining like genre moments, right? The fact that the further down the rabbit hole Ethan gets in the search for his son is the fact that, you're going to be lopping off limbs, driving the wrong way of traffic, and also, basically like avoiding these electrical pylons, which is like this insane mini game basically, or quick time event that you end up doing. Like those are the aspects of Heavy Rain that I appreciate. And because those little moments sprinkled throughout it give it a bit more juice, I think, in terms of like, okay, we're doing this narrative that's pretty straightforward enough, but we're going to have these little moments that are very genre focused and ridiculous, but they work, I think, because of the fact that, as we've already said, a great deal of the heavy lifting with this game is done by the mood and the atmosphere that's evoked from the ways in which the story is told, rather than the story it's actually telling, and whatnot. And so, yeah, I think that for me, though, again, like when I come back to the characters, because it's a pretty notable design aspect of this game, is that we're getting multiple perspectives that are providing multiple lenses for exploring this world. Everybody has their own sort of like skin in the game, so to speak. And I think that that's one of the aspects that really makes Heavy Rain's approach to the like police procedural or detective procedural be a lot more like all encompassing than just the kind of like standard point of view that we get. Cause like if this game was just Norman Jaden, FBI agent who also happens to be a drug addict, like, okay, then it's kind of just exactly what you would expect from a game that's about a serial killer. So having the FBI agent, the father that's, dealing with various themes of fatherhood and guilt and these things. And then you've got the journalist who, what's their number one thing is curiosity, right? And determination to tell the story. And then you also have the PI, and that's someone that's a little bit more vague, but at the same time, like this obsessive, like moral component to the people that he's interacting with, right? And that everybody has a different thing that's driving them, and I think that ultimately makes the characters more interesting than perhaps like the world itself, right? Because even if these people are these specific archetypes or can be trope heavy in some ways, like you get to see the world through their eyes, and their story and direction is a little bit more singular rather than just like this copy and paste kind of examination of the world.
Yeah, I think in trying to make like a multiple choice story,
Mm.
I think it does make the characters suffer a bit in terms of like what they could be, and if you maybe made it a little more refined. But I know the ambitions to make this story that could go all sorts of ways, and that's fine. It does mean that depending on certain outcomes, just feel a bit more ridiculous because of what you've done with the characters in that time. Because most of what matters is like basically whatever you do in like the final chapter or so, and then anything before that is like meh. So that's where like the illusion of choice of them sort of changes for you, where you like, oh, okay, so all that really matters is what I do in this finale, effectively. If I want to really like see the outcomes be different, but at the same time, like the important thing is getting those characters to that point, as we said, and having that sort of different paths. And it could have been very tricky as well, having like two characters that effectively doing actually three characters basically doing the same thing, which is like, oh, I'm investigating this, like, and from a journalist, from a private eye, from an FBI agent, and having all three of them basically do that job, it could have been very repetitive. And so to make them so different, and then Ethan is different as well because he's more directly involved in what's going on. Yeah, that works for me just to a large degree. It does definitely break it up, in a good way. But going back to that sort of end point as we're coming towards the end of this, the reveal of the killer is, yeah, I didn't much care. They have to explain it in like a flashback, effectively, which is like, yeah, that doesn't really help us, does it? The sort of thing, like, and yeah, I mean, I don't know whether to even get into it. I know the game's 15 years old, but they like to spoil things. So if you want to play Heavy Rain still and you haven't for some reason, because of reputation or whatever, this is the point to stop listening, as we'll just talk about the ending, or the endings, if you will. So, okay, now we're going to talk about it. So, we learn that earlier in life, Scott Shelby saw his brother basically drown because his leg was trapped, and he was getting there's rainwater pouring into his place, and he couldn't get out. And he went back to get his dad to help, and his dad was too drunk to help, like that, and so he had to watch his brother die. And so basically, this is his thing for being the serial killer. It's like that he abducts boys in those same scenarios, basically, like to drown them in rainwater and see if their dad can basically fight for their child. And given that this is like happened a few times by the point that it happens to Sean, Ethan's kid, yeah, clearly there's a few dads that have failed quite miserably at this point. So like, so yeah, I get the reasoning, and that's fine. I think it's again one of those things that does just feel like Euro horror in terms of, especially like that sort of giallo sort of killer thing of like, yeah, this happened to me as a kid and it traumatized me and blah blah blah, so I do this now, sort of thing. And of the characters that you play, if anyone was going to be a bit didn't feel a suspect, it was him. They
Mhm.
really did sort of over egg the nice pudding, I think, in terms of like trying to make him seem like quite a nice guy, because that's the idea. He's like, he doesn't mind people and whatever, but he's only investigating the cases effectively to ensure that he gets the evidence, and he can just burn
Mhm.
stuff, like, which is, like, I don't think that would work very well being that close to the case, but there you go.
To be fair, I thought that was kind of cool in that, while the reveal and I suppose the overall like explanation is kind of whatever, to be honest, because it feels a little bit generic. I did like the idea though that it paints what you've been doing as that character in a
Yeah.
completely different light. That aspect I thought was pretty cool. Now, I don't know if that necessarily alleviates the other issues that we have with the handling of the reveal overall, but I did think that that was notable in that, the handling of that, and like, oh, the player has actually been a lot more integral to the killer's, you know, quest, if you will, than
Mm.
they even realized. And like that aspect of it, I thought was interesting and kind of cool. But yeah, that doesn't change the fact that it's a little, I don't know, it's a little melodramatic and predictable. Other than that,
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like they set it up a bit too much, in terms of like trying to give you this red herring of like someone being super nice. It's almost too much, but I think at least because the other characters are in the moment, you're too busy thinking about what this character's doing, what they're finding, to really think that you'd be playing as one of one of the characters you're playing as would be the killer. Like that in itself is a cool sort of reveal. That you do effectively lose control of a character, not because they've died, but because the circumstances have changed. I don't know, which I mean, maybe a bit more control over him beyond that would have been interesting, like that, and how that shapes the fate. But at the same time, at that point, we have to get into the end game of everyone left to basically come and stop him and find Sean, and that's where basically, depending on what you do, your endings will change. Like in a scenario, like Ethan can go alone, or you can go with Madison. Norman can be there, or any sort of combination, depending on what decisions you've made in like the preceding sort of chapter. And as a result, that changes the ending. Like you can get the most satisfying ending that there is, where like Ethan they save Sean, and he starts this new life with Madison, who becomes romantically involved with part of the plot in as much as people talk about the Jason scene, the sex scene is like we've come some way since that. Let's just say that. So it doesn't look great, but yeah. So you have that, and and Norman gets like all the plaudits for being a hero and all stuff. But yeah, it can go like the absolute opposite way, and like I mean, I didn't do it this time. I think the ending where the worst ending is basically like Madison gets killed, Sean doesn't get saved, um, Norman doesn't. It gets great guilt over not saving and Sean, and then basically overdoses, and Ethan gets framed as the origami killer. And that's it. So Scott escapes, I think, as well in one of them, and Ethan basically just commits suicide. You
yeah,
can have
well,
the super grim ending in that
really,
regard.
Dad of the Year doesn't have a great ending. Go figure.
Yeah, that's it. So I don't know. In a way, like with the way the game starts, it kind of feels like it should be bookended by the sweet saccharine sort of thing, like where everything's happy da la la. But I don't know. It's given how much misery there is in the game, like it is quite funny to think that the worst ending of just like nobody making it and everyone kind of succumbing, Madison to her curiosity, and Norman to his drug addiction, and yeah, well, Ethan to just not being good at being a dad. It seems, but like, but yeah, it's like, I mean, you lose one kid, it's careless. Two, it's definitely pushing it a bit much. But I mean, just going back to the end, the reveal as well. Like the other red herring they give you is like that Ethan has these blackouts, so it could be him. He could be the killer. So they do kind of play with the idea that you could be the killer. Like, but it's like as cop outs go, again, that doesn't really go very far. It's just kind of there for convenience. But anyway, yes. So I like that you do have this sort of a multitude of endings that can happen, different combinations, and like people dying or not dying, and like it all seems rather like DVD extra sort of thing. Like oh, here's an alternate scene of what could have happened. But that's great. It'd be great if you had films that did that. The way you could just insert it into the film more smoothly. Just like decide that's the way the film goes, and yeah. So that aspect, great. Just not quite sure where and how the game should really end at that point. Should it be mawkish? Should it be dark? Should it be somewhere in between? And as we never got a sequel, so we won't ever know. But and probably for the best. But yeah, I think it's an interesting sort of example of that sort of period of time where choice and multiple choice endings were like the hot thing in games, and like the idea of choice, and people got very finicky about like, well, does it matter if you do this thing and it doesn't ultimately affect the ending? I was like, no, it doesn't really. But I think we've learned in the years since then that choice is a thing that isn't just about the big things. It's about making them about the character, and about what you think the character should do. Little bits of that in here, but yeah, the problem is there's like a big disconnect between like the choices that are inconsequential and then the stuff that matters. If you want to see something different in terms of the end of the story, and because like so the acting isn't great and all the other bits, you don't really feel rewarded in the same way, I suppose, for like going down certain paths or trying certain things like in the general story like that. They are just curiosity, like, oh, what happens if I do this, rather than like I want to know what happens if I do this.
Yeah, I have to say I like that the endings are directly tied to like certain major decisions that you make rather than tallying up the like QuickTime event fumbles, because there's definitely a couple instances there where holy shit, I definitely fucked up a good number of those. And there's actually a hilarious video where someone plays the whole game and like purposefully fails all the QuickTime events, which is just a laugh. Everybody that has played this needs to go check that out. But like, it was one of those things that like, I suppose that aspect for me that hasn't aged great is like the over reliance on QuickTime events, because you get to the point that a game has so many of them, but then they're fairly inconsequential. Like,
yeah,
that ends up being the type of thing where it's like, yeah, when I'm playing through it, I'm glad that it doesn't like drastically alter the ending that I get, but it just makes me think about, in the interim, having played, things like Until Dawn, right? Where, failing QuickTime events can actually have some pretty devastating, depending on how you look at it, like outcomes for characters and their fates and these things. Like, that's actually what I lean towards more. Have less events and put more emphasis on their importance rather than having an abundance of these events that don't actually have that much impact on how a scene plays out, other than I watch my character stumble for an extra second or a second and a half, and then I'm just right back to where I was. So in that aspect, for me, that's probably the one aspect of gameplay, or I don't even know if you'd call it decision making, that doesn't necessarily hold up that well for me. But I do like that this game has a variety of outcomes based upon decision making. And when you add in multiple characters, and depending on how much those characters sort of like work for you, how much you're able to start to begin to care for them, that can make for a game where you start to think about those choices in a little bit more sort of like context, the overall narrative. So I did like the fact that there were more stakes involved for characters and choices, but at the end of the day, like, I'm not going to play this game more than once or twice. So I'm not going to be the person that goes out of their way to like find all those endings. So in the long run, I don't know if it necessarily does much for
YouTube.
me, even if I appreciate it.
Yeah, YouTube's out there. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
like
exactly.
we've evolved as a society to not have to put ourselves through such pain. Yeah, you were talking at the beginning, obviously, about like the legacy of this game, and you mentioned Until Dawn. You know, that is quite fascinating when you think about it, because both these games, started with they had Move integration, the PlayStation Move stuff. Like the original version of Until Dawn was designed with that in mind. Before they ditched all that shit and basically like that. But yeah, so being around that sort of same design, and then sort of like Until Dawn kind of being like, that did feel like the next step. Like, I think that's why it ended up resonating with people a lot, because it did take a lot of what Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls did, and turn it into a more effective video game, that works and feels cinematic, really gives you the director feel of like choice, and like circumstance. And I suppose with the original version, the camera's still having like some control, but not too much control. And like, yeah, it does feel like, especially for PlayStation, in terms of PlayStation exclusives, like, and that model of game, that was definitely the game that did it and really sort of like refined it to a degree. Flaws that it had, as we've discussed, when talking about the game before. But yeah, Until Dawn definitely feels like the game we could have got all the kinks worked out with time, sort of stuff like that. But beyond that, as the Telltale stuff came like a few years after that. I think it was still actually happening around this time, but it was more point and clicky than it became. And yeah, I think Heavy Rain had enough of an impact that I do think there are certain things about it that did push us down certain paths, especially Sony, who really did look to have like these games with like motion capture and like more realistic things in them, and ultimately you think in a few short years how much better like acting. I mean, even the year before this, Uncharted 2 is like comes out and is like the epitome of like blockbuster gaming, in terms of like feeling like a movie whilst never really trying to be outside. It just did set pieces and things and really like. So yeah, Heavy Rain ends up being like part of this like where Sony would go with PlayStation, and where their like mainline games would begin to feel more cinematic, and that's the way gaming went. I mean, during that sort of era, this is why the PS3 kind of turned things around, because we had games like that would just sort of be different to what else was out there. And I don't know, given Sony's sort of market, Microsoft is in the computer business, and Sony generally is in the music and movie business. So it kind of makes sense that was the path they went down. And yeah, Heavy Rain, and especially I think going on to what Quantic Dream did next with Beyond Two Souls, where they actually got Hollywood talent in, like to play the main roles. And sure, you notice the difference in terms of like what that brought to that game in terms of acting quality, but everything had moved on by that point. That game came out the same year, I think, as The Last of Us, and that didn't help it at all. In terms of like, not to like put The Last of Us on that pedestal, because it doesn't need that really at this point. But there's a game when we talk about the impact in terms of like making a cinematic game, if you will, in terms of like character development and acting and writing. Like, it's not, again, things have got better since in certain ways, but it was another sort of jump. At a time we didn't really see that period of time. The PS3 to PS4 period is probably the last sort of proper visual upgrade that we got in terms of like technology, and where you could take characters and things you could do like that. We've plateaued a bit in the time since then. But so this is, for a console that was awkward anyway, like games like Heavy Rain, like great relics of that time, in terms of they really capture the essence of what consoles were at that point and where we were sort of going to go. So Heavy Rain ends up being very important as that.
Oh yeah, I mean, in many ways, I think this game was probably a trendsetter in some regards, right? I think as we've now, 15 years on from the game's release, the types of games that have this very like cinematic approach, like whether they've advertised themselves as such or if they've rather just taken some like pretty strong notes or indications of things that worked with Heavy Rain and just built upon those aspects or utilize those aspects in ways to tell their stories in maybe less conventional ways, to the degree that that became so popularized that you don't even mention it now sometimes in games, or it's like the third or fourth thing you mention because you might not be able to say like, oh, well, this is groundbreaking, or the types of terminology that they used when talking about Heavy Rain upon the time of its release. But now as some of those things have become more commonplace, it's like, oh yeah, they're notable, but people don't always lead with them as being like the reasons why this thing is important. Which there's conversations to be had there, and I think that for me, what was most interesting about getting to play Heavy Rain all the way through for the first time in 2025, 15 years after its release, was the fact that there are still elements that shine through about what makes this game unique and what made the game clearly, deserving of the praise and the critical reception that it received at the time of its release. Some things haven't aged that well, but that's how it goes, right? I think with anything. But I think that the previous thing that I'd said about the elements of this game that made it notable back then are still aspects that make it notable to this day, even if maybe I'm not going to have the same like 9 out of 10 perception or thoughts on this game that, some people did back in the day when they reviewed it for the first time. I still enjoyed this game a great deal and can appreciate the things it does differently. But I like coming to games such as this when you are years removed from some of the, the hype surrounding it, if you will, because we see sometimes when anything, whether we're talking about games or film or what have you, we see things that have a good deal of hype around them and how they get lauded. And then, a month, 3, 6 months, a year later, how's the conversation evolving around this type of game or movie or again, what have you? So yeah, it was nice to get to come to this game free of, maybe I won't always wait a decade before playing something that comes out. But I think in this case, it was nice to come to it free of all those things. So, yep, that's kind of the beauty of making the case for, even if so far both games we've covered for that, they're not incredibly difficult games to sell, right?
No.
But I think that it's just a nice opportunity to kind of talk about games that we don't necessarily have like a timely reason to. This happened to be 15 years, whatever. That wasn't why we picked it or you picked it, but it's just nice to have a reason to come to some games and chat about them, free of maybe that timeliness or that sort of like perception that can come with the hype circuit, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like I said, given the reputation that this game has taken a bashing in the time since, like I said, for various reasons, David Cage chief among them. But yeah, it's still like to go back and look at what it did. It is interesting, and find. Yeah, I mean that's what we generally do anyway. It seems we like to find the good in things, if you will. And this was definitely a challenge that was quite fun to do in that regard because I thought I'd feel worse about it, I must say. Okay. Yeah, and again, that's probably just like the pollution of the internet in the last 15 years has probably made me think that. But also because we've moved on so much. But yeah, no, you can still see stuff in the same way that when we go back like further, and when we talked about like the 90s, we talked about all these games that they for now maybe you can't work with them, but what they did so important sort of thing. So yeah, like we're not saying Heavy Rain's groundbreaking, but I think you got to say it has aspects to it that matter, in terms of what we see in gaming now.
I think that's part of the beauty. You get to chat about things and usually aspects that made them unique then still hang around and make them unique now. So I'm glad that you picked this one, and who knows, maybe we'll explore that other, what was it, Beyond Two Souls? Maybe we'll chat about that at some point in the future. See if they were able to maybe learn some other aspects of design from Heavy Rain and were able to impart that onto another narrative of theirs, which, as you said, is supposedly much stranger than this one. So that could be a fun chat for the future. But yeah, until then, my friend, as always, it's a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
Back at you, my man. Until the next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Safe Room. If you enjoy the show, please rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter and Blue Sky at Safe Room Pod for show updates. As always, our main episodes of Safe Room drop every Monday, but our bite-sized episodes of Horror Bites, our indie horror showcase, drop every Thursday. You can follow the Horror Bites Twitter account at horrorbites_SR. You can join our Discord channel, Safe Room Podcast, to chat with us and other horror fans about the genre we all love. And finally, you can send emails to saferoompod@gmail.com if you'd like to share your thoughts on a game we have or are going to cover. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.